Alright, so 5562 or travel history information, a country-specific form that may or may not be required for your spousal sponsorship application. So let's cover where to find it, how to know if this form even applies to you, if it does, then who fills this out and who does not, how to best list your trips, and finally how to think of this dependent section. So assume I'm the sponsor, I could be a permanent resident or a citizen of Canada and I'm sponsoring my wife. So my wife becomes the principal applicant. So this form 5562 is the travel history of my wife and any dependent children that she may have who are 18 years of age or older. This form has nothing to do with me, the sponsor, or my wife's mom, dad, brothers, sisters, or her permanent resident or Canadian citizen children. More on that in a second. So you'll start here. This is the permanent resident portal. This is where the principal applicant, my wife, will create the account and start the application using her own credentials. And this is inside the application. So here's the 5562. This is a digital form, has to be filled right here inside the PR portal. There's no PDF, no printing, scanning in the initial submission of the application because this form is digital. So right away you'll notice all these other digital forms have this required keyword listed next to them, meaning they are mandatory. They have to be filled out by all principal applicants. But this form 5562 doesn't have that required keyword, and thank God they fixed it. So this means this form may or may not be required. Not everyone will need to fill this out. So how do you even find if it's required? So remember I told you in the beginning, this is a country-specific form, only required to be filled out by outland applicants from certain countries based on their country of residence. So let me show you what I mean. So to find your country-specific requirements, you'll get to this page. This is your guide 5289, the official guide for spousal sponsorship. And if you scroll down, you click on step 3, complete the application, scroll down even further, and you'll get to the document checklist and any country-specific requirements section. So you open this link, answer these questions, and based on your selections, it's going to give you your country-specific checklist. So who are you sponsoring? So you select spouse, common law partner or conjugal partner, whatever applies to you. I'm going to select my spouse. Then what country does the person being sponsored live in? Meaning what country is the principal applicant living in right now at the time of submitting the application? Meaning the current country of residence of the principal applicant. And then what other countries has the person you're sponsoring lived in? Meaning any other countries of the principal applicant. This mostly refers to the principal applicant's home country or country of nationality or citizenship. Then when you click on Get Checklist and Forms, based on your selections, it's going to give you your document checklist 5533. This is pretty much common to every spousal sponsorship applicant. But down here, it's also going to give you your country-specific requirements. And this form 5562 should appear here based on your current country of residence. So if the form doesn't show up here, you don't have to fill it out. And if it shows up here, you have to fill it out. As simple as that. So we'll come back to this page in a second, but if I scroll up and click on this document checklist, you will get this form, document checklist 5533. This is also a mandatory document and it's required to be filled out and submitted by all principal applicants. So this is not a country specific document by itself. You have to upload this in your PR portal when you submit your application. But if you scroll down under part A, forms required, if you keep scrolling down to point 7, country-specific requirements, it says you, the principal applicant, must check the country-specific requirements on this link. So this is just the link that we were on a second ago to confirm if any additional forms are required based on your country of residence. So if this form is required, you will just mention the name of the 5562 form here and any additional forms that may be required, and then you go to the online portal and fill those forms out. So basically your current country of residence is going to be a vital factor in determining whether or not you require the 5562. So let's take a few examples and this is going to become clear. So let's assume my wife, the principal applicant, is living in India at the time that she's applying for spousal sponsorship. So this becomes an outland or family class application because the principal applicant is outside of Canada. So since my wife is currently living in India, she's going to select India here in the first option. Then in the second option, she's going to select her country of nationality or origin. So since India is the only country that she's lived in and that's her country of citizenship, she's going to select India here again. She's not lived in any other country, so she doesn't need to add any other country. Then she's going to click on Get Checklist and Forms, and if she scrolls down under country-specific requirements for India, this form 5562 is going to show up. So this simply means that for all applicants who are residing in India at the time that they are applying for spousal sponsorship, this 5562 is going to be a required form. So as an outland applicant living in India, you will have to fill out this 5562. Now let's assume my wife is living in Canada at the time of submitting the application. So her current country of residence, the first option here becomes Canada. And then the second option is going to be India because India is her country of nationality or citizenship. So based on these selections, if she clicks on Get Checklist and Forms, if she scrolls down, she is going to notice that under country specific requirements, this form 5562 doesn't show up. Why? Because this form 5562 is dependent on the current country of residence. Because the current country of residence for my wife in this case is Canada, she's already in Canada, she is not required to fill out the 5562. And this makes sense because she's already in Canada, so when she might have applied for her tourist visa or her work permit to first come to Canada, whenever she came to Canada, she must have already provided her travel history to IRCC. So IRCC already has my wife's travel history because she's already in Canada. And that's why as an inside Canada applicant, she doesn't need to provide the 5562. Another example, let's say the principal applicant is currently living in Philippines. So this first option will be Philippines. And the second option, the country of nationality or citizenship, is also going to be Philippines, assuming that the principal applicant doesn't have citizenship or residency of any other country. If you have citizenship or residency of any other country, then you will click on Add Another Country and provide those details here and click on Get Checklist and Forms. And if you scroll down under country specific requirements for Philippines, you are going to notice that 5562 doesn't show up. So basically this is telling me that if your current country of residence is Philippines, you're not required to fill out 5562. Let's take another example. Let's say the principal applicant is an American citizen who's living in Canada at the time they're applying for spousal sponsorship. So this first option, current country of residence, where the principal applicant is currently living in, becomes Canada. And the second option becomes the country of nationality or origin, which is United States. And based on these selections, if I click on Get Checklist and Forms and if I scroll down, this form 5562 still doesn't show up. And we kind of already expected that because the current country of residence is Canada. And if you're already in Canada, this form is not required. Let's flip this situation. Let's say the principal applicant is an American citizen living in America at the time, meaning living in United States. So the current country of residence becomes United States. And again, you select United States of America here again if you are only a citizen of United States of America and if you have not lived in any other country. And then based on these selections, if you click on Get Checklist and Forms and scroll down, again, as you can see, 5562 doesn't show up. So that's the point here. This form 5562 will only show up based on your current country of residence. If you're already in Canada, it's not going to show up. If you're outside of Canada, depending on what country you are in, it may or may not show up. And that's why it's very important to first go to this page, fill out these details and get your country specific requirements, and then only fill out the 5562 if these country specific requirements tell you to. Otherwise, you don't need. So once you open this, you'll get to this basic instructions page, and there are 3 sets of instructions here, and these can often get confusing. So let's break them down. The first set of instructions says that the principal applicant must complete this form in bold. So this should right away tell you that this form is for the principal applicant. We already talked about this. Then here it says you must complete all sections. This includes, if applicable, those for your spouse or common law partner and each dependent child over the age of 18. So we'll talk about this dependent child in a second. But first, this spouse or common law partner keyword gets people confused. So don't be alarmed by this spouse or common law partner. This is not referring to your sponsor. I told you before that this portal is being used for other streams of permanent residence as well. For example, the PNP stream or the parent or grandparent sponsorship stream, for which the spouse or common law partner keyword will make much more sense. But for spousal sponsorship, the spouse or common law partner is not your sponsor in this form. So you don't have to provide the travel history of your spouse or common law partner. So my wife is the principal applicant, I am the sponsor, so my travel history is not required, only my wife's travel history is required. Now the second part of instructions here says that you, the principal applicant, must fill out this form for yourself and on behalf of your family members 18 years of age or older who are not already Canadian citizens or permanent residents. So right away, this should tell you that people who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents, their travel history is not required. Since the sponsor, who could be the spouse or the common law partner, is a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, that's a requirement to sponsor your spouse, that's why the sponsor's travel history is not required. So first of all, this family member in the context of spousal sponsorship are your dependent children. not your mom, dad, siblings. Remember, we are talking about spousal sponsorship here. If you're applying for some other stream such as the PNP program or the parent or grandparent program, then these instructions can be interpreted differently. But we are only talking about spousal sponsorship here. So in the context of spousal sponsorship, family members here are referring to your dependent children. And who are your dependent children? Your children who are under the age of 22, not married nor in a common law relationship, and not permanent residents or citizens of Canada are categorized as dependent children. So if your child meets all these three conditions, only then your child will be considered as a dependent child. If you have a dependent child who's 18 or older but still under 22, otherwise they won't be a dependent, only then you will provide their travel history, otherwise you won't. This is all going to make much more sense as we take a look at a few examples down the line, so stick around until the end of the video. And by the way, I've also covered this dependent section, who to add as dependent, who not to, and how it affects the digital forms in much more detail in this video, which is showing up on the cards here. It's linked in the description below. I'd highly encourage you to check that video out first to learn all about dependence and how it fits in the digital forms section, and then you can come back to watch this video. If you've already seen it, then continue to watch. So for a simple spousal sponsorship, when you don't have any children, you don't really need to worry about these instructions. Simply provide the travel history of the principal applicant. This was the case for me and my wife. It was just me sponsoring my wife, so only her travel history needed to be provided. Finally, there are instructions on what kind of trips to include and how to provide your travel history. So it says here, you need to enter a history of all the trips you have taken outside your home country or the one you live in. So home country is your country of citizenship or nationality. So any trips that you have taken outside of it. So let's say my wife's home country is India. So all trips that she has taken outside of India, she is going to account those trips here, not within India. If your current country of residence is Canada, then all the trips outside of Canada, not within Canada. And let's say you're living in Canada at this point when you're submitting your application and your home country is India. So trips from Canada to India don't really need to be accounted because Canada becomes your current country of residence and India becomes your home country. Again, more of that in a second when we take a look at some examples. And as far as the time period is concerned, you only have to account for trips that you've taken in the last 10 years, previous 10 years since the time that you're submitting the application, or since your 18th birthday. So for example, if you're 25 years of age right now, then you don't have to go back 10 years because your 18th birthday is before that. So you only account for your trips since your 18th birthday. And if you're 30 years of age right now, then you go back all 10 years and provide all your trips since you were 20 years of age. That's what this means. So here's section A. This is about the principal applicant. So my wife in this case, and first up, she enters her full name, so family name and given name in English and in native script. And by the way, you only have to provide this native script for names of people. So not the names of cities or countries that you have traveled in. Only names of people need to be written in native script. And then she has to provide her trips. So for the purpose of this video, let's take a hypothetical example of all the trips that my wife has taken over the past 5 or 6 years. And let's see how you can account for them in this form. So here's the timeline of the trips that my wife has taken. Let's start with my wife being in India. Let's say in 2015 August, my wife traveled to Italy from India for 10 days and back. And this was for the purpose of tourism. Then in 2016, let's say my wife went to Canada on a student visa, eventually got her work permit and stayed there until 2020. Then within this time period from 2016 to 2020, she also did some international trips outside of Canada. So let's say in 2017, my wife went to US from Canada and then back to Canada for the purpose of tourism. Then in 2018, let's say my wife went to India, her home country, from Canada for a vacation, and then she came back to Canada. Then in 2019, let's say my wife went to Greece from Canada for a vacation and came back to Canada. And let's say in 2020, she left Canada for good and went back to India as her work visa was over. And now my wife is being sponsored for permanent residence from India, so she's an outland applicant. So let's see how we can account for all these trips that my wife has taken. So now here we are going to list her trips, and they've not really specified an order in which you have to list your trips. So you can list in ascending order or descending order. That's completely up to your preference. For the purpose of this video, let's stick with an ascending order. So her first trip was from India to Italy. So since India is her home country and the trip to Italy was outside of her home country, she will have to account for that trip here. So let's say she traveled in early August and came back in late August. And the year was 2015. So the from date becomes 2015-08. And the to date also becomes 2015-08. It's fine because that just means that you traveled within the same month. And the destination, they ask you to enter the city and country. So let's say she entered Italy in Florence, So Florence is the city and then country Italy. And she may have traveled in several cities within Italy once she landed there, but you don't have to account for all those cities. You only enter the city where you entered that country, and that should be fine. Then the length was say 10 days and the purpose of travel was tourism. So now to find the from and to dates, the first thing you can do is to check your passport for stamps. If they stamped your passport at the port of entry, they must have mentioned the date there. But often immigration officers don't stamp your passports at port of entry. That's also fine. In that case, you'll just have to do some digging. So go through your email and try to find your boarding passes or tickets which will have those from and to dates. And again, you don't have to be exact with these dates. They've already given you only the year and month. So that already makes it easier for you. So try to find the date which is as close as possible to the actual date that you traveled. Even if you're around the ballpark, you should be fine. And now my wife doesn't have to account for the trip back from Italy to India because India is her home country. So she's simply coming back to her home country, and you only have to record the trips outside of your home country or current country of residence. So trip back from Italy to India doesn't need to be recorded. Only trip from India to Italy has to be recorded in this case. Now let's say in 2016 April, my wife applied for student visa and came to Canada for her studies. She completed her studies, then began working and worked until 2020 April. And then she went back to India for good. Now, because she applied for tourist visa from India for Canada and came on a legal status and then converted it into work permit, she doesn't really need to account for this trip here because they already have these records. But even if you record this trip here, it's not really going to hurt your case. It just helps to provide more clarity. And this is also going to help make a case when I explain the subsequent trips to you. So 2016 April is the from date. And 2020 April is the to date. Destination where she landed was Toronto, Canada. Length was 4 years and purpose of travel was study and work. Now keep this time frame in mind, 2016 April to 2020 April when my wife was in Canada, because during this time frame she took other trips as well. So it's going to help in understanding how to account for those trips. So let's say in late 2017 May, meaning end of May 2017, my wife traveled to US from Canada for a 3-week trip just for tourism. And she came back to Canada in early June. So the from date becomes 2017 May, and because she came back in June, the to date becomes 2017 June. And for the destination, let's say she landed in Newark airport, so the city becomes Newark and the country is United States. She doesn't have to account for all the other trips that she may have taken within United States, only the city that she entered United States from. And then let's say the length was 3 weeks and the purpose was tourism. Now again, my wife does not have to account for the trip back from US to Canada because Canada is her current country of residence. So only trip from Canada to US needs to be recorded, not the trip back. Now let's say in 2018, my wife went to India from Canada for vacation and then came back to Canada. So these trips don't need to be recorded because Canada is her current country of residence and India is her home country. And according to the instructions, you only record trips outside of your current country of residence or outside of your home country. Because India is her home country, she doesn't need to record trip back to her home country, and Canada is her current country of residence where she's living on a legal status, she doesn't need to record the trip back to Canada. So it's 2019, my wife is back in Canada on a work permit, and let's say in 2019 March, early March, my wife traveled to Greece for a 3-week period on a tourism trip. So since Canada is her current country of residence, and Greece is outside of her current country of residence, and she traveled to Greece, she will have to record this trip. So she'll click on add another, and another trip section is going to open up. In the from date, she enters 2019 March. Let's say she traveled within March, so the to date also becomes 2019 March. Let's say the destination city country was Athens in Greece, she landed in Athens. Then the length was 3 weeks and the purpose of travel was tourism. And again, the trip back from Greece to Canada doesn't need to be recorded because she's simply returning to her current country of residence, which is Canada. And then finally in 2020, my wife traveled back to India from Canada for good. So she left Canada. She simply returned to her home country, India. So again, this trip also doesn't need to be recorded because she's traveling back to her home country. So a few things to keep in mind when you're accounting for your trips. Number one, when you travel from one country to the other, and if you have a layover in another country in between, and you don't leave the airport, you don't really need to account those trips. So let's say you travel from India to United States via Frankfurt, Germany, and you just had a layover in Frankfurt, you don't really need to account for that trip. Unless you leave the airport and actually get inside that country, you don't really need to account for that trip. And let's say you had more than 200 international trips over the past 10 years. So this form is not probably going to allow you to enter all those here. It has a limit. So in that case, they have given you the instructions. You can just upload the information for the trips 201 plus in the supporting documents table on the main application page. Meaning this page under additional supporting documents, you can just select the other category. and just create a Word document and add all your additional trip details there. Label it 5562 additional trip details, and you can just upload it there. Alright, section B is your spouse or common law partner. So we just talked about this. Your sponsor, who's your spouse or common law partner, because they are a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, their travel history doesn't need to be provided. So what you can do is simply list not applicable here in the first text input field under destination, or you can also write not applicable in abbreviation NA, and in parentheses you can write spouse is sponsor. However you prefer, you just don't have to provide sponsor's travel history here, and you will be fine, so don't worry about that. Then section C is your dependent children 18 years or older. So first of all, if you don't have any children, then you don't even need to worry about this. You can simply write not applicable in the first text input field under given name and you're done. But let's say you have children. So the first thing you do is to be sure whether those children are considered dependents. And we just talked about this before. In order to be considered as dependents, your children must be under 22, not married nor in a common law relationship, and not permanent residents or Canadian citizens. Only if your child meets these three conditions, then it's considered a dependent in the context of a spousal sponsorship application. Once you're sure that your child is considered a dependent based on the three conditions that we just talked about, then you look at this age criteria. If your dependent child is 18 years of age or older, only then you provide their travel history, otherwise you don't. So for example, let's say you have a 10-year-old child, not a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, obviously not married or in a common law relationship. Then based on these three conditions, the child meets all of these. That's why the child will be considered a true dependent. But because the child is under the age of 18, that child's travel history doesn't need to be provided. So you ignore that. But let's say you have an 18-year-old child, not a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, and not married nor in a common law relationship. That child is still considered a dependent, but this time the child meets the 18 or older criteria, and that's why that child's travel history has to be provided. So in this case, if your 18 or older child has traveled internationally, then you simply provide the trips just like you provided your trips for the principal applicant. If the child has not traveled, then you simply provide the name of the child here and check this box did not travel, and you're done. And again, just to reiterate, if you have a Canadian citizen or permanent resident child, then their travel history doesn't need to be provided. So that was a country specific digital form. Unlike these three digital forms, which are not country specific, they are mandatory for all principal applicants. Here are their tutorials. I'll see you there.